It was a day she would never forget, one of those days that leaves a permanent mark on your life. She woke up early that morning with a knot in her stomach, a heavy feeling that something big was about to happen. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, and the house was quiet, but her mind was anything but calm. She got out of bed slowly, her heart racing as if her body already knew it was about to face something life-changing. When she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Tired eyes, a face full of fear, but also a faint spark of determination she hadn't noticed before. She dressed carefully, each piece of clothing feeling like armor, preparing her for the battle ahead. Stepping outside, the cold morning air hit her face, sharp and grounding. Every step she took toward the place where everything was supposed to happen felt heavier, like she was walking toward a moment she'd been avoiding for years. She didn't know if she was ready, but she knew one thing. She couldn't keep running away. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the crunch of her shoes on the gravel. Her hands were clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms, as if the physical pain could distract her from the storm of emotions inside her. She kept replaying the events that had led her to this moment. The lies, the manipulation, the feeling of being trapped in a life she never chose. But today, she told herself, would be different. Today she would take control, even if it scared her to death. She didn't know how it would end, but she knew she had to face it head on. As she turned the corner, the building came into view, and her breath caught in her throat. This was it. No turning back now. When she walked into the building, the air felt heavier, like the walls were closing in on her. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, each one a reminder of how alone she felt in that moment. She could hear her heartbeat in her ears, loud and fast, as if it were trying to escape her chest. The place was familiar, but it felt different now. Cold, unwelcoming, almost hostile. She clenched her jaw and kept walking, forcing herself to put one foot in front of the other. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one kept repeating itself. This is your chance. Don't back down. She reached the door she'd been dreading and paused, her hand hovering over the handle. For a second, she considered turning around and leaving, pretending none of this had ever happened. But then she remembered why she was there, why she had to be there. She took a deep breath, turned the handle, and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, and the atmosphere was tense. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her shoulders as she walked further in. Her eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, the worn-out chairs, the faint smell of coffee, the clock ticking loudly on the wall. It all felt surreal, like she was watching herself from the outside. She sat down slowly, her hands trembling as she placed them on the table in front of her. The person she'd come to meet was already there, sitting across from her, their expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was deafening, filled with everything that had been left unsaid for years. She swallowed hard, trying to find the words to start, but her throat felt dry, her voice trapped somewhere deep inside her. Finally, she cleared her throat and spoke, her voice shaky but determined. "We need to talk." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded, as if they carried the weight of everything she'd been holding back. The person across from her didn't respond immediately, their face still unreadable, but she could see a flicker of something in their eyes, surprise maybe, or discomfort. She took another deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her hands were still trembling under the table. She clenched them into fists, nails digging into her palms again, using the pain to ground herself. "I know what happened," she continued, her voice gaining a little more strength. "I know what you did, and I know why you did it." The room felt even smaller now, the walls closing in as the tension between them grew. She could feel her heart pounding, but she refused to look away. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to let fear silence her. The person across from her finally spoke, their voice calm but with an edge she hadn't expected. "And what do you think you know?" The question felt like a challenge, and for a moment she hesitated. But then she remembered all the nights she'd spent lying awake, replaying the events in her mind, piecing together the truth. She leaned forward, Her eyes locked on theirs and began to lay it all out. Every detail, every suspicion, every piece of evidence she'd gathered. As she spoke, she could feel the weight lifting off her shoulders, replaced by a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. But with that clarity came anger, a burning rage that had been simmering beneath the surface for far too long. "You thought you could control me," she said, her voice shaking but fierce. "But you were wrong." The room fell silent again, the tension so thick it felt like it could be cut with a knife. She could see the person across from her processing her words, their expression shifting from calm to something darker, more defensive. "You don't understand," they said, their voice low and measured. "You don't know the whole story." But she wasn't backing down. Not this time. "Then tell me," she shot back, her voice steady now. "Tell me the whole story, because I'm done living in the dark." The person across from her hesitated, their eyes narrowing as if they were weighing their options. For a moment, she thought they might refuse to say anything, might just get up and walk out. But then they leaned back in their chair, their expression shifting to something almost resigned. "Fine," they said, their voice quieter now, less defensive. "You want the truth? Here it is." They began to speak, their words slow and deliberate, as if each one carried its own weight. She listened intently, her heart still racing but her mind focused. They talked about things she hadn't known, details that filled in the gaps of the story she'd pieced together. But with every word she could feel the anger inside her growing, not just at them but at the situation, at the years she'd lost, at the lies she'd believed. They explained their side of the story, their voice steady but tinged with something she couldn't quite place. Regret? Maybe. Or guilt. They talked about the choices they'd made, the reasons behind them, and how they thought they were doing the right thing at the time. But as she listened, she realized something. Their reasons didn't justify what they'd done. Not to her. Not after everything she'd been through. She felt a surge of frustration but also a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about them anymore. It was about her, about reclaiming her life and her power. "I understand why you did it," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "But that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't change what I've lost." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words hanging in the air. She could see the person across from her processing what she'd said, their expression shifting from resignation to something softer, almost apologetic. But she didn't need their apology. What she needed was to take control of her own life, and that's exactly what she was going to do. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling shaky, but her resolve stronger than ever. The person across from her looked up, their eyes wide with surprise, but she didn't wait for them to say anything. "I'm done," she said, her voice steady now, filled with a determination she hadn't felt in years. "I'm done letting you control my life. I'm done living in the shadow of your choices." She turned and walked toward the door, each step feeling like a reclaiming of her power. Her heart was still pounding, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from the adrenaline of finally standing up for herself. As she reached the door, she paused and looked back one last time. "This is my life," she said, her voice firm, "and from now on, I'm the one in control." The person across from her opened their mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. They just sat there, their expression a mix of shock and something else, maybe respect, or even regret. She didn't wait to find out. She turned the handle and stepped out into the hallway, the cool air hitting her face like a wave of relief. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt free. The weight that had been crushing her for years was gone, replaced by a sense of clarity and purpose she hadn't known she was capable of. She walked down the hallway, her steps quick and confident, her head held high. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it, on her own terms. As she stepped outside, the sunlight hit her face, warm and bright, like a sign that she was on the right path. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the fresh air, and smiled for the first time in what felt like years. This was just the beginning, but it was a beginning she had chosen for herself. She walked away from the building, her heart lighter and her mind clear, ready to take on whatever came next. As she walked away, she felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, pride, and even a little fear of the unknown. But for the first time, the fear didn't paralyze her. It fueled her. She thought about everything she'd been through, all the pain and the lies, and realized that they hadn't broken her. They had made her stronger. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing. She was no longer the person who had walked into that building earlier that day. She had faced her fears, confronted the truth, and come out on the other side. And that was something no one could ever take away from her. The streets were busier now, the world waking up around her, but she barely noticed. Her mind was still replaying the conversation, the way she'd stood her ground, the way she'd finally spoken her truth. It felt like a dream, but the warmth of the sun on her skin and the sound of her footsteps on the pavement reminded her that it was real. She felt lighter, as if a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying had been lifted. For the first time in years, she felt like herself again, not the version of herself that others had tried to shape, but the person she was meant to be. She stopped at a small park on her way home, sitting on a bench and letting the quiet calm of the morning sink in. The birds were chirping, and the leaves rustled in the breeze, a gentle reminder that life went on. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself just breathe. It wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but she felt ready to face them. She had taken back control of her life, and that was all that mattered. As she sat on the bench, she pulled out her phone and hesitated for a moment before opening her messages. There were a few from friends who had been checking in on her, asking how she was doing. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she could answer honestly. She typed out a quick reply, her fingers moving faster than her thoughts. "I'm okay. Better than okay, actually. I'll explain later, but just know that I'm finally free." She hit send and smiled, feeling a sense of connection she hadn't realized she'd been missing. It wasn't just about standing up to the person who had controlled her for so long. It was about reclaiming her relationships, her voice, and her life. She scrolled through her contacts, her thumb hovering over a name she hadn't reached out to in years. It was an old friend, someone she'd drifted away from because of everything that had been going on. She hesitated for a moment, then typed out a message. "Hey, it's been a while. I'd love to catch up if you're free." Sending it felt like another step forward, another way of reclaiming the parts of herself she'd lost. She put her phone away and leaned back on the bench, closing her eyes and letting the sun warm her face. The park was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt peaceful rather than lonely. She thought about everything that had happened that morning, how far she'd come in just a few hours. It wasn't just about confronting the person who had hurt her. It was about realizing that she was stronger than she'd ever given herself credit for. She had faced her fears, spoken her truth, and taken control of her life. And now, sitting there in the sunlight, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. After a while, she stood up from the bench, feeling a renewed sense of energy. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do next, but for the first time in a long time, that uncertainty didn't scare her. It excited her. She walked out of the park and onto the bustling streets, the noise and movement around her a stark contrast to the quiet she'd just left behind. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, she felt alive. She stopped at a small cafe on the corner, ordering a coffee and sitting by the window to watch the world go by. It was a simple moment, but it felt significant, a reminder that she could enjoy the little things again, that life wasn't just about surviving anymore. As she sipped her coffee, she thought about the future. For so long, her life had felt like it was on hold, like she was stuck in a loop she couldn't break free from. But now, everything felt possible. She didn't have a plan, and that was okay. For the first time, she felt like she could take things one step at a time, without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on her. She pulled out a small notebook from her bag and started jotting down ideas, things she wanted to do, places she wanted to go, dreams she'd put on hold for too long. It wasn't a perfect list, but it was hers, and that's what mattered. The cafe buzzed with activity around her. But she felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in years. She realized that this was what freedom felt like, not just the absence of control, but the presence of possibility. She finished her coffee, paid the bill, and stepped back out into the sunlight, ready to take on whatever came next. As she walked down the street, she noticed things she hadn't before. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the sound of laughter from a group of friends sitting at an outdoor table, the smell of fresh bread from a nearby bakery. It was as if her senses had come alive again, reminding her of the beauty in the world she'd been too numb to see. She stopped at the bakery and bought a pastry, something sweet to celebrate the day. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a victory, a way of saying to herself, "You deserve this." She took a bite of the pastry as she continued walking, the sweetness filling her mouth and bringing a smile to her face. It was such a simple thing, but it felt symbolic, like she was finally allowing herself to enjoy life again. She thought about all the times she'd denied herself happiness, all the times she'd told herself she didn't deserve it. But now she knew better. She deserved to be happy, to feel free, to live her life on her own terms. As she walked, she passed by a bookstore and decided to go in. She hadn't read for pleasure in years, always too caught up in the chaos of her life to sit down with a good book. But today felt different. She browsed the shelves, running her fingers over the spines of the books until one caught her eye. It was a novel about resilience and starting over, and it felt like the perfect choice. She bought it without hesitation, feeling a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in a long time. With the book in hand, she walked back to her apartment, her steps light and her heart full. When she got home, she made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, opening the book to the first page. As she read, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. It wasn't just the story. It was the act of doing something for herself, something that brought her joy. She realized that this was what life was supposed to feel like, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her again. She read for hours, losing herself in the story and the quiet comfort of her apartment. For the first time in what felt like forever, she wasn't worrying about what came next or dwelling on the past. She was just present, enjoying the moment. When she finally put the book down, the sun was starting to set, casting a warm golden light across the room. She sat there for a while, watching the sky change colors, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for how far she'd come. That night, as she got ready for bed, she looked at herself in the mirror again. This time she saw someone different, someone stronger, someone who had faced her fears and come out on the other side. She smiled at her reflection, a small but genuine smile, and whispered to herself, "You did it." It wasn't just about what had happened that day. It was about everything she'd overcome to get to this point. And as she climbed into bed, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't felt in years. The next morning she woke up feeling different, lighter, freer, more in control. She made herself breakfast, something she hadn't done in a long time, and sat by the window to eat. The world outside was busy, but she felt calm, like she was finally in sync with herself. She thought about the day ahead and realized she wasn't dreading it. For the first time in years, she felt excited about what the future might hold. As she ate, she thought about the small steps she could take to keep moving forward. She didn't need to have everything figured out right away. She just needed to keep going. She pulled out her notebook again and added a few more things to her list. Call an old friend, take a walk in the park, maybe even start looking for a new job. It wasn't a grand plan, but it was a start. And for the first time, that felt like enough. She cleaned up her breakfast dishes and got dressed, choosing an outfit that made her feel confident and comfortable. As she looked at herself in the mirror, she felt a sense of pride she hadn't felt in a long time. She wasn't the same person she'd been yesterday or even the day before. She was stronger, braver, and more determined than ever. And as she walked out the door, she felt ready to face whatever came next. As she stepped outside, the morning air felt fresh and full of possibility. She took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of being alive and free. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it, on her own terms. She walked down the street, her head held high and her heart full of hope. It wasn't the end of her journey, but it was a new beginning, one she had fought for and earned. And as she turned the corner, she smiled, knowing that whatever came next, she could handle it. She was finally free. The streets were alive with the sounds of the city. Cars honking, people chatting, birds singing. It was a world she'd been too numb to notice before. But now it felt vibrant and full of life. She walked with purpose, her steps steady and confident, as if she were reclaiming every inch of the life she'd lost. She thought about the people she'd reconnected with, the dreams she'd started to chase, and the small moments of joy she'd allowed herself to feel. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers, and that's what mattered. As she reached the park, she sat on a bench and watched the world go by. The sun was warm on her face, and the breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself just be. For the first time in years, she felt at peace. Not because everything was perfect, but because she was finally in control of her own life. She opened her eyes and smiled, knowing that this was just the beginning. She had faced her fears, spoken her truth, and taken back her power. And now, she was ready to live.